actually. As you know, as many of you probably know, once a year I have a trip up to Scotland, specifically to Stornoway on the Isle of Lewis. And when I was there, I'm not going to give you a talk about inspecting gas holders this morning, though, so you'll be very relieved. But that's the purpose of my trip. But while I was there, every year, I normally get a bit of a walk round in Stornoway while I'm waiting for my flight. And this year, I was walking around the town, and Sean will get the next slide up. I saw this, and I thought, great, I could spend a couple of hours in there looking at the Lewis revival. And then I realised actually it was just an antique shop. But straight away, my mind went to the Lewis revival, which I have actually read about in the past, but it did turn me to just go and have a look at some of the remarkable things that happened during that time of revival. So we'll have the next slide. We're going to be having a look at the 1949 to 1953 Lewis, and then some people know it as the Hebrides revival because it did spread out from Lewis to some of the other islands. And it was actually the last revival in the British Isles. And it started in the village of Barvos on the Isle of Lewis, which is about 12 miles away from Stornoway. And it spread through Lewis, through the island, and to the other Hebridean islands. But interestingly, it largely bypassed Stornoway, which is the main town on Lewis. Well, how did it begin? The short answer is that, as with all revivals, God started it. But even though God worked in mighty power, he used men and women in the process. God had evidently been at work in the hearts and lives of his people and moved people to pray. There were two elderly sisters that were praying that God would do his work in the community. They were particularly concerned that the church was void of any young people. And I think when they say young people, I think they mean people sort of like under 40 because, as I said, they were older, they were very elderly. The sisters believed that God was going to move in power. And they spoke with the minister of their church, Mr. McKay, and suggested that the office bearers of the church should meet twice weekly in prayer. Not just for a short prayer meeting, but pray through the night. And he agreed that they would do that, and they met Tuesday nights and Friday nights, and they did it for about 6 months. There were other prayer meetings taking place at that time, impromptu prayer meetings, and God was reviving his people in this small, unheard of village. The outbreak of God's power appears to have really, I wouldn't say stemmed because obviously it had already started, but it came in remarkable power at a prayer meeting when a man stood up and read from Psalm 24, part of Psalm 24. Who shall ascend into the hill of the Lord, or who shall stand in his holy place? He that has clean hands and a pure heart, who has not lifted up his soul to vanity, nor sworn deceitfully. And then he prayed, have I clean eyes? Have I a pure heart, Lord? And then he could pray no longer. He fell to his knees and onto his face. And from that time, the people knew that God was at work. There was an evangelist known to the church at Barvos, and he was written to and invited. It was before the times of emails and things, so I suppose he could have made a telephone call. I don't know, maybe not in 1949, I'm not sure. But they wrote to him and invited him to come along and spend 10 days in Barvos preaching at a Bible convention. And Duncan Campbell, who was the evangelist, declined the invitation due to having a convention arranged on the Isle of Skye. But the faith of the sisters mentioned earlier was demonstrated again. We have to remember that God is working in an extraordinary way, in so much as the sisters were sure of what God was doing. Now, unbeknown to Duncan Campbell, the convention on Skye had to be cancelled because the Hebridean Tourist Board had booked all the hotels for an event. So Christians hoping to travel to Skye, to the convention, had nowhere to stay. So Duncan Campbell did spend 10 days on the Isle of Lewis, but he didn't only spend 10 days, he ended up staying there for 3 years. On the night that Duncan arrived on Lewis, he preached at the church, and the congregation was about 300. We're definitely in need of revival, aren't we? Because we probably have a lot less than that number, especially given that it was a very Lewis. I don't know what the population of Lewis, but it's quite small. Probably around that time, the population of Barvas was around 4,000 people. So it was a lot of people, but they knew that they needed reviving and they need God to work. There was 300 people there, and it was reported as a good meeting, but nothing spectacular. However, following the meeting, God's power broke out, with many people flocking to the church building, and another meeting was held well into the early hours of the morning, with many people being saved. And then Duncan Campbell was then asked to go to the police station, where people from a neighbouring village had congregated. People were being filled with the fear of God, and they wanted to speak to a Christian, and they knew that the constable was a believer, so they flocked to the police station. And Duncan went to the police station and spoke to the crowd outside, and again, many were saved. Many extraordinary and unusual occurrences are recorded. People stopped their work, and people stood around and congregated in the fields, on the roads, and they were talking about God and their needs as sinners. And many people were saved over not just those few days, but over a 3 to 4 year period. God's extraordinary power wasn't short-lived. And the revival spread to other islands on the west coast of Scotland. But the revival never reached the mainland of Scotland. The United Kingdom has been blessed with many revivals in the past. The last one in Wales was the Welsh revival in 1904, and then the last one in England was the Lowestoft revival in 1921. And in reading the accounts of the Lewis revival and other revivals, have noted that there's generally some common things, that some of those are definitely those, because these are scripturally based and true. Some of them are things that can be observed from these revivals. So a revival cannot be decided upon by man. It can't be planned. Revival is a sovereign act of God. Revival reveals the holiness of God, or during the revival, God reveals his holiness. During revival, God's people are made aware of their sin and their own need of holiness. Prayer is costly and inconvenient. It's not just the odd prayer meeting that people might go to. People are given to prayer over often longer periods of time. Unsaved people suddenly become aware of God and are filled with fear. God's presence can be felt tangibly by believers and by unbelievers. Unbelievers break down in the street and other inconvenient places as they become aware of God's holiness, as they become aware of God's judgment upon sin. God's power is demonstrated by the saving of many people, and God's power is shown in many unusual and extraordinary ways. So we do pray that God would send revival even in our time, but that shouldn't really distract us from God's work overall. We still need to be about witnessing to our friends, those that we meet, and we still need to think about evangelism, but we do need to wait for God to work in extraordinary ways as well. Thank you.